Welcome to Accessible, where we open the door to the people and ideas shaping the disability community. I'm George Gatto.
And I'm Amelia Reigard.
On Accessible, we talk with leaders, advocates, researchers, and individuals with lived experience to explore the issues shaping the disability field.
Accessible is produced in partnership with the Missouri Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, or LEND, and the Missouri University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, or UCED for short.
And whether you work in the field, are connected personally to disability, or simply want to better understand how systems can support people with disabilities, Accessible opens the door to conversations that matter.
Hey guys, producer Catherine here. We have a really special episode for y'all today. We're sharing a recording from our Accessible Podcast Book Club, where a small group of staff, students, and community members came together over Zoom to discuss Being Heumann, the memoir by Judith Heumann and Kristen Joyner. If you're not familiar, Judy Heumann was a pioneering disability rights activist, often called the mother of the disability rights movement. She played a pivotal role in major milestones like the 504 sit-in, and really spent her life advocating for access, inclusion, and civil rights for disabled people around the world. She passed away in 2023, but her impact continues to shape the world we live in today. This was an amazing conversation, so many good reflections and thoughts, and I think all of us are taking a lot from the experience of reading this book, and we're excited to get to share it with you.
So welcome everyone to the Accessible Podcast and our first ever inaugural book club meeting. We are really excited about this, and we're excited that you're joining us here. Just so you know, this is a part of the Accessible Podcast, and Amelia's going to let you know what that means, and Catherine probably will too, but we are going to be recording it, and we'll eventually be sort of disseminating it out. We'll put the podcast out as we usually do on all our different platforms. So, but welcome. We're really glad you're here, and we're looking forward to having a really engaging conversation.
George, you actually knew Judy, so will you kick us off?
Yeah, I did know Judy Heumann. When I was in my early 20s, early in my career, I worked at the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disability in Arizona, at Northern Arizona University. And one of the projects, I was actually hired to work on this project because I spoke Spanish, but it was a project that we had working with a group of individuals. It was called Acceso Libre, and which means free access. And they were really fighting hard in Oaxaca, Mexico, to have access to work opportunities, to government buildings, etc. And so this book actually enlightened me a little bit. I didn't know. I just knew that this was an exciting project, and I got to go to Mexico and work with these really dynamic people. It was really wonderful. I didn't know when I started that job that the reason that project even existed was because this person, Judy Heumann, who was really important to human rights, equal rights for people with all kinds of disabilities in the United States, took an interest in other organizations internationally and in the rights of people with disabilities internationally. And so Judy, at the time, this was in the 1994, and I was just a young person in my early 20s. She put together a funding package for a group to go down to Mexico and work with, anyway, it could be anywhere in the world, and work with kind of advocacy groups around the world. And so we happened to know this group, or one of my boss knew this group in Oaxaca, Mexico. She hired me to help because I spoke Spanish. But that whole project shaped my career. Since that time, I actually haven't really worked anywhere but a UCED, a University Center for Excellence in Disability. That's what we are at the Institute for Human Development. I also worked at the one at the University of Kansas. Every state has one of these centers, and Judy was actually really instrumental in kind of setting priorities for centers like ours and the one in Arizona. Anyway, I was young. She was scary to me because she was like the boss from Washington, D.C. So I just kind of sat back and was very kind of quiet. Obviously we spoke a little bit, but I was a graduate research assistant, so I just kind of sat back and learned, listened, and but she was super nice. But she did have a very um, powerful personality. She just had a presence when she came in. The person that I knew really well is if you read the book, is someone that she talks about, and I love how she described him when she starts talking about the man she actually ended up marrying, Jorge. And he, talking about his broad shoulders, I was like, well, he did have broad shoulders, he does have broad shoulders. And he's just a wonderful, dynamic person. But he's from Mexico. And he actually took a real interest in our project, actually, because he was from Mexico. And he came down to Oaxaca with me on, I think, two or three different trips. I have trouble remembering now. And we traveled all over Oaxaca, Mexico together, visiting with these indigenous communities, with these grassroots organizations of people with disabilities, seeing how we could help them with our project really meet the goals of their project. So I really became pretty good friends with her husband, Jorge, and and just everything about that project. If you know me, you know that I ended up spending a good portion of my career in Mexico working on that project. And then my wife and I took our two young children down to Mexico, and I did my dissertation research in these villages that Jorge Pineda and I went and visited. And so, anyway, I can't say that I knew Judy well. I knew her husband well, and but her work and her presence in my career at that just at that time when you're kind of figuring out what you're going to do, just totally launched me and launched my career in a particular direction. And so I was just very grateful for her even before I read this book. And then after reading this book, it helped me really kind of put dots together that I hadn't even thought about before. And so um, it was a wonderful experience.
That is really neat that I mean, I can just tell but reading her memoir and that she was a giant in the movement. And so the fact that you got to work alongside her and alongside her husband is just really cool. I wanted to go over a bit of the historical context in this book because when we picked the book, I was like, okay, we're going to read Judy's memoir. It's going to be great. But it was such an amazing disability civil rights history. I mean, she was involved in just everything. And so I wanted to highlight some of the pivotal legislation that's talked about in the book that really are some of the key decision points that Judy was involved in. Of course, she talks a lot about her personal experiences and her life, but I want to ground us first in that historical context, just so we have that, and so our listeners have that as well. So a lot of the beginning of the book goes over Section 504, which was part of the Rehabilitation Act. It was really one of the first U.S. laws to say that people with disabilities cannot be discriminated against. It applies to places that receive federal funding like schools, hospitals, and public programs. So Section 504 became law in 1973, but it didn't actually do much at first because the government hadn't written the rules to enforce it. So in 1977, activists, including Judy, which is a big part of those, the section where she talks about the sit-ins that they had at the Hugh buildings, activists protested to push the government to finally put those rules into place so that the law could actually start protecting people. Another big movement that's discussed in the book is the independent living movement, which was led by leaders Like Judy and Ed Roberts from Berkeley, California, this movement said that people with disabilities should have control over their own lives. It's not just about leaving institutions, but about having choice about where you live, how you live, and what supports you use. This movement led to the creation of independent living centers across the US, which help people live in their communities. And then, of course, this book talks about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which was passed in 1990. This is a major civil rights law that builds on the earlier work of Section 504. It says that public places and services must be accessible to people with disabilities. This includes things like ramps, accessible transportation, communication access, and protection from discrimination in jobs and public life. Tons of other things are talked about in the book. Again, she's involved in so much. She touches on education rights through like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. She talks a bit about Medicaid, right, and those policies that allow the government to fund support for people living in the community. Lots of things are discussed in this book. I would encourage the book for anyone who is wanting to understand the United States disability history, because it's such a thorough exploration of those big major policies. So Judy's story really shows us that these laws just didn't happen on their own, but they were fought for and fought hard for by people with disabilities and other allies. So anyways, that's just some history to kind of ground us. It's been really interesting because if you've been following along with this season of Accessible, the podcast, we've been talking a lot about two main ideas in this book. The first being advocacy, right? How do you do it for yourself, on behalf of yourself? How do you do advocacy in your workplace? And how do you do kind of big, broad advocacy at a legislative or policy level? And then we've been talking about current events. We've been interviewing and talking to policy specialists and people who are on the ground doing the work, and talking about how current policy changes, current culture is shaping the lives of people with disabilities. And so it's been really interesting to revisit the history. Like, why do these things exist? How did these things come to be? Really helps give us a context for where we are now and how we move forward. And of course, we are doing this podcast book club because we want to hear from you guys, and we want to invite the community in to discuss Judy's life. So with that kind of large historical overview, thanks for bearing with me. I want to open it up to kind of like our first official book club question, you guys. So I'm curious to the group, did you know about Judy or the disability rights movement before reading this book? And what surprised you?
And I would say yes. Having been a special education teacher, I have some of that background. And then obviously, having worked with the university as long as I have and co-teaching with George, I think I first learned about Judy watching Crip Camp, so I could understand the extra credit assignment for a class that I was co-teaching. And then like with the Right Ahead that is with Sam and Dan Habib, they interviewed Judy. And so just seeing her face, and there was a PBS special, and somewhere in that timeline, I read the book for myself, and I actually listened to it the first time, and just to see all the pieces fit together. And every time I go back, there's something new that I pick up on.
I'll say that I've heard of Judy being in the field of disabilities, but ironically, I had heard of Ed Roberts more with the independent living movement. I should say it's not ironic. I had learned about him in a class. But it's interesting because in the book, Judy highlights some of the sexism that she and other women in the movement experienced at the time, and how there was differential treatment towards the men in the movement. And so anyways, to know that she was such a big part of the Centers for Independent Living movement in Berkeley, California, and I had not known that, but I had heard of Ed Roberts and some of the other big names, I just thought was interesting. I was like, oh, okay. Shelley?
Yeah, I've heard of Ed Roberts before Judy, but I've always been fascinated with civil rights, disability rights. In fact, I'm working on the Missouri lawsuit of 504.
Oh, wow. So a
Did
lot of
the
that history
book,
is really important to
yeah,
you.
did the
Yes.
book has it influenced you at all in that?
I knew about 504, I just didn't know all of it and how important everything was to the ADA.
Again, it's just amazing how many things Judy was involved in um, throughout her career.
So I was curious if any of you as family members or as people with lived experience with disability did did Judy's story resonate with your own experience, or was it different in some way?
This is Shelley again. And then all through high school, I had to fight for everything. So I guess in a way, Judy's story did hit home. And I
Yeah.
remember having to fight for elevators in high school, fight for parking spaces.
Isn't that amazing? And the work that Judy was doing clear back in the 50s and 60s, and then, even when 504 was finally passed in the early, well, I want to say it was the early 80s, right? It was 80 or 81. I just learned that. But um, it's amazing that then, Shelley, you still were having to fight for those things in your schools. Yeah, Melinda.
Yeah, I would say I would resonate with parts of her story. Um, uh, Back to the previous question, like I didn't know who she was until I read the book. I don't know a lot about, unfortunately, about disability rights movement, even though I've lived with a disability for almost 40 years. But uh, I think it is interesting to your point and to Shelley's that like the fight is still going for things that have been we've been fighting for a long time, and I've experienced that in even my work life, my professional life prior to coming to IHD. Still fighting for parking spaces and things like that. So and still learning like about advocacy and what even 504 even means, what ADA even covers. So I found that like really, I mean, like really inspiring and like resonating with me. But there was something that she said, and I can't remember the exact quote, and I listened to it, so I couldn't highlight it or anything. I should have taken a note down. But she said something interesting about like the baby boomer era like that and their perspective um, what people with disabilities, that it was something to overcome. And sorry, I'm not trying to jump into something
Yeah.
else, but
No,
while
you
I was
do.
thinking about it, like something to overcome instead of something that that like that society or our environment helps us live with. Um, uh, that really resonated with me because that's something that like I kind of grew up believing. And so it helped me to see it from her perspective from so long ago that it always hasn't been like it's not like that for everybody, and that there is change coming to that perspective. So that was good.
Yeah, I think that is such a great point. In the class that Catherine Reagan and I teach, one of the things that we talk about are these different ways of thinking about disabilities or different models of understanding disability. And that medical model is so um, ingrained in everything we do in certainly in the United States, and I would assume other countries as well. And it was so one of the things I loved about this book that I guess I hadn't really even thought about before was just how all of that advocacy that Judy was doing and her friends, when they were in San Francisco, and then all of her work later really helped to shift. And she talked about the shift in the culture and the shift in thinking from going, like Melinda, I listened to the book, and so I don't have notes written down, or I don't have things highlighted, but so I'm not going to get her words quite right. But she talked about that shift from going from the medical model um, to sort of a social model or a social understanding of disability. And I know that's not the word that she used. She maybe talked more about a policy and legal understanding. But certainly I think that she and her compatriots had such a big influence on the way we now think about disability as not being something that has to be cured or healed. So it's not an illness. It is just a part of the human experience.
Yeah, I feel like producer Catherine with a comment. Um, the way that before Section 504 and all of these things, it wasn't really obvious to anyone that what was happening to people with disabilities was discrimination. Like that's not really how they thought about it. It was just like, well, this is just the way things are. And that shift of realizing that these a whole group of people is being discriminated against, I think gave some like teeth to the fight. And like once they started thinking of it that way, so many things started becoming clear. And I feel like we're still kind of teasing apart some of those barriers that are still in place in a lot of areas of life. Um, but that how that kind of shift in thinking to a more of a social model rather than a medical, like it's something that someone needs to overcome, sort of started that.
I mean, it is interesting throughout history, medicine and science have been used to do sort of this othering of other major groups, right? Like even back in the day, there's pseudoscience that sort of explains or tried to justify slavery, right? And so um, a lot of civil rights movements were about this sort of acknowledgement that, like, hey, we're a part of human diversity, right? Like the, an attempt to like undo, I guess, the othering, for lack of a better term. She says something later on in the book about, because we talked a little bit about how there so much legislation, so much was happening in the disability civil rights movement, and yet so much has been failed to be fully implemented, right? That's come up even in some of recent conversations, like not necessarily full implementation of like IDEA and some of these things. And she talked a little bit about the problem about all the conversations when like ADA was passed, is there wasn't the same level of consciousness raising experienced like there was around African Americans in the civil rights movements in the 60s. And so while there was these great things happening in policy around disability civil rights as a society, we were not aware in the same way, and therefore some of those fights are still ongoing, right? There wasn't that sort of like cultural shift.
Hmm. Yeah, Catherine Reagan.
Catherine, not the producer. Just to kind of build on that, on page 109, it they said it's still separate but equal in a new form. And when you think about even Brown v. Board of Education, if you look at when the ruling was made, they didn't think it was going to be fully implemented until 2020. So just the time sometimes that it takes,
Wow.
and we still experience that. Like IDEA was in effect when I was in school, but it wasn't fully implemented. I think about people 10, 15 years younger than me that truly went through, in theory, their K-12 education with IDEA in place, and how far we've come, but how far we still have to go, and how these different movements build on each other. I think just the way she explained things and her activism really helped me understand it does take time. So as
Yeah.
hard as it is to practice patience, we're further than we were yesterday.
Yeah, I have two thoughts, and I don't know which one to go with first, but so many things are came to mind from this book and from your all's comments. But one of the things just historically about, I we didn't ever have a single child with any kind of disability in my school because 504 hadn't been passed until I entered middle school, and IDEA didn't exist when I was um, in in school. So everyone was shipped to a school for I won't even say what it was called because it's now would be a term that's not acceptable. But the thing that I really was thinking about, particularly, I think something Melinda said resonated with me. But what do you guys think that Judy Heumann would think today, knowing that like for example, in Missouri, we still have it's still legal, and in the whole country, it's still legal with a waiver, a particular type of waiver to pay people with disabilities below minimum wage or not pay them at all, pay them very little. So that's legal in the United States. It's still legal to have separate but but equal schools for people with disabilities. We have those kinds of schools in Missouri. It's still legal to have people live in um, habilitation centers separate from you know from people, the general population, or in outside of the community. And I just wonder, like, based on what you read, how do you think, what do you think Judy would be doing today, I guess, if she were to know all of this stuff? Because we know that she would be active in some way.
George, your question makes me think back to when Judy's describing the sit-in at the health education and welfare building, and they send a couple of congressmen in, almost like, I don't know, to go like work it out, get these people out of the building. They've been in there for days. They've been living in there, right? Hear them out and then be like, we're gonna move forward. This is maybe not the exact turn events, but it was said separate but equal, right? Like, we hear you and it's gonna be equal, but it's gonna be separate, right? And Judy was just like, no, thank you. You do not get it. And so, I can't really suppose to think exactly what Judy would say if she was here
Yeah.
today, but I do think she would be very angry. And I do think she would say, no, it's not good enough. I think, to me, a theme in the book is she continues to push for full inclusion and full equality. And she's just like, she was not afraid to make, and I think actually, Catherine, I feel like I'm stealing your words here, producer Catherine, because you had mentioned this morning. She wasn't afraid to make people uncomfortable. She just wasn't. And there was a point in the book where she talks about silence, and how so many times in her life, she was met with either silence or avoidance of a question she has. Why can't she go to school? Why can't she go to kindergarten with everybody else? Why can't she become a teacher, right? Why can't we pass Section 504? And she's like, silence and avoidance is meant to deter us from continuing to speak up and continuing to press forward. And she just was not having it. She said, I will continue to speak up. I will always speak up. So that's how I would answer that question, is I think she would have a lot of words for those issues.
Yeah.
Ashley.
I was thinking a lot about this question, George, too, and I think she would be very disappointed, but also not surprised. I think from how much she pushed for all the things, but we all know how things can go, both positive and negative. And as time and our society changes, and our outlook and perspective from leaders and people that make decision makers, that it's an ebb and flow, and not always a positive one. But I also think that it wouldn't stop her. And I always think about, she never stopped asking the why. Why not? Why can't I? And so that was a powerful message in the book for me, is like, just keep asking the why, and don't stop. So I think she would be disappointed, but I think she would still be proud of where we've come, but know that there's a lot more room to grow. So.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I thought to me was very impressive, and I had mentioned that when I, was just beginning and knew Judy, you know. Um, and she would, I was afraid. I was intimidated by her, because she was this big figure, and I was afraid to speak in those meetings and whatnot. So it shocked me. Like I was genuinely surprised in reading the book when she would say, even later in life in situations, she'd say, I said this thing or I stood up for that thing, but I was so scared and second guessing myself the whole time inside. And I just thought, wow, I mean, that to me was the symbol or this of real bravery to be afraid to do something and recognize that this is a scary thing for me, but it's so important that I'm going to do it anyway. And I don't know, it made me have even more admiration for her in her life. I know the feeling of being afraid to say something or afraid to stand up and not doing it, like choosing to just, oh, I'll just not say anything. I'll just be quiet. And here is this person in a wheelchair. Essentially, I think she said she had quadriplegia as a result of polio, and she's willing to stand up in ways that um, are very difficult. I just even have even more admiration and respect for her and her life than I did before as a result of that.
Judy talks a lot about democracy in this book and how it's supposed to work and how us as citizens are meant to be involved in that. And I'm curious, um, your thoughts on that. Like, is this how you view democracy as this, interaction between the citizens and the government?
As I said in the outstart, I have not read the book, but talking about democracy um, and disabilities, too often in the years of us advocating for our daughter's rights because she cannot advocate for herself. Um, and you're talking about speaking up and doing that. But yet, time and time again through the years, you have rights and bills, come forward to establish these for the individuals. But then it seems as though it's almost a matter of convenience. I think I would term it from the position of the politicians, especially when it comes to budget. Um, they give you funding, and I'm saying this because this is going on right now. The governor of our state has proposed like approximately a 33% cut in the funds for rehabilitation programs and uh, salaries for individuals who support disability people with disabilities who are in the self-directed services program. Um, and so I don't know what the answer is because it's very a repetitive cycle, I guess I would say, that when funding becomes scarce, the social services invariably are the very first thing that they look to cut.
Uh, one of the things that kind of going back to what I was going to say anyway, and then what you said, I think like that comment about that Judy made in the book that about democracy and the fact that it is like this, um, like there was something she said, and maybe Amelia, you have it, but where she said, laws can be passed, but until you begin to insist that they be followed, they're just kind of they're ignored or something like that. And so I think it's like it's hard and it is very tiring to do it. But I think that's probably where she would say is like we have to keep insisting that our rights are met under these laws. Um and so Um, anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on that, and that idea of democracy being a conversation. It's and sort of this. It has to be. You have to actively engage in it if it's going to work.
I was just going to add on that when you were talking about needing to insist that it's not just the person impacted or their family. It really is this collective we, and that idea of allyship is so important. I think disability is a good example because any of us can enter that community at any time. So when we're talking about disability rights specifically, just it really is all people, and we all have a responsibility, not just the person impacted by the law, the regulation, the budget cut. Because what impacts one person eventually will impact the entire nation, civilization.
Yeah, there's this, I think on this point of democracy, I've just been itching to say this all day because this part of the book just really got me, you guys. So here we go. At the very end of the book, she kind of ends it in present day at the time, I guess. This book was published in 2020. Unfortunately, Judy passed in 2023. Is that, well, wait, yeah, in 2023. So she's not here today, but I think she leaves us, the readers, with like this choice that is really profound, and definitely will be my takeaway from this book. But she says at the end, if you're of an age where you've grown up with all these benefits, curb cuts, disabled kids in class, captioning and audio description on television, and the myriad other ways disabled people are integrated into our communities, you would be forgiven for thinking that this is how it is, how it's always been, and how it always will be. It would be understandable if you took these rights for granted. But our government is constantly changing. It was created by groups of people, and it gets changed by groups of people. This presents us with a choice. Do we want to be the people creating the government we believe in, or do we want to be the people simply accepting whatever comes our way? So what do you think about the question? I mean, how would you answer that question for yourself?
I think she's hit the nail right on the head. It's a constant effort. We had a situation with our daughter. Her program at one point, because our home district did not have a program for her, was in a building that housed nothing but individuals with disabilities. And it was individuals from multi-schools, districts. And we encountered a situation. The nurse in the school one year was reassigned to another school. And we said, so what are you going to do about this? What are you going to have there to service these people, these individuals? Because most of them had medical needs, and the nurse had to distribute medicines. And we said, what are your qualifications of the person that's going to replace this nurse? And the only qualification they had was that person needed to have a happy disposition. No first aid CPR even required. And so we said, well, you know what? If something happens to our daughter that endangers her life, we will consider you responsible. And we got a note in her backpack on a Friday afternoon saying she could not return to services at that building. And there were no other services available in her home district because that's why she was there to start with. And so we did take action against them. We ended up actually going to court. And you talk about taking action and advocating. That is a very time-consuming effort. And, it's kind of like the laws are there. Why should I have to be going through this? But it is what it comes down to, for us anyway, was a gut-wrenching experience. And my husband at one point tried to go down to Jeff City and talk to the people that are supposed to be your advocate. I don't remember the name of the department now. And so he called them and told them he was going to be in Jeff City for a meeting. And could he come by? And they said, sure. So he went in to talk to them about the case. And after about 10 minutes, the guy in charge actually got up and opened the door and said, well, it was nice talking to you. I'm sure you have other things to do today. Now, this is from somebody who was the boss of the attorney who was representing us. And it kind of gives you the sensation that you're out there fighting for your child's rights. And the people who are supposed to be helping you really all, this sounds probably kind of harsh, but it seemed like to us, all they were interested in was collecting their paycheck, not really supporting our daughter and her rights. So I'll shut up.
No, thank you for
thanks
sharing
for
that.
sharing.
Yeah, thank you
I
so
think
much.
Charlene, if you end up reading the book after this, I think you'll enjoy some of Judy's stories and some of the tenacity that she has. You're describing in the way that you and your spouse have advocated for your daughter and getting dismissed time and time again, right? And how you continue to come back and say, no, we will do right by our family member or loved one, by myself. So I hope that you get a chance to dive into the book. Other thoughts on the choice that Judy lays out at the end of the book, or we are getting close to time here. Just anything else that you would say is your takeaway?
I think Judy put it fairly well. One person can make a difference.
Yeah.
And I believe that strongly. I sometimes get tired of people saying, well, one person can't, it won't make a difference.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. You're absolutely right. Yeah, Melinda.
Yeah, I think I I resonated a lot with Judy's personal stories, living with a disability, that part, probably more than like some of the more like policy stuff. Um, uh, and so some things that I really loved about her or that like spoke to me and that like I feel like I could like visualize who she was is when she was younger and people would stare at her when she was with her friend and she would tell them like take a picture to last longer. Like she always had that just like the courage and that like the I'm gonna stand up for myself, and it like you can see that it like lasted and took her in, the tenacity and all that took her into all the things that she did. But I just love that about her, like that even from a young age she was like, I'm not gonna, like I'm not gonna take bullying or people making me feel like I'm less than or any of that. And I just really loved it, really like spoke to me, that part of her.
I have always been grateful for Judy Heumann in my life, because it really did sort of help set a trajectory for me that maybe I don't know. I don't know where I would have gone, but I just want to being around her and the people that she knew, and helped me find a mission or a purpose in my life and to end my career. And so I have always been grateful for that. And then reading this book just sort of makes me realize I was even luckier than I knew. I just was a very lucky person to have been engaged with her for that brief period of time, and with some of the people with whom she worked. So, and then, as I mentioned before, her husband was just a wonderful person to be around. So,
I feel like there's a sense of, I don't know, thinking back to your question about like what our choice is and thinking about sort of Judy's philosophy of this like collectivism and bringing everyone in, also along with the idea that the disability culture is not defined by any one race, age, geographic location. It can be anyone at any time. And so in some ways, that's a challenge for unifying, but in other ways, it's a huge opportunity to be that microcosm of possibility of what society could be. And sort of like the disability community is an example to us of how to be better listeners, how to think differently than ourselves, and how to include everyone, even when it's not convenient. Yeah, so I just feel like I am always in awe and learning from being in proximity to that. And just also the way that she organized with other movements and included other movements. I think we are still seeing that today, just sort of working across different marginalized groups and how so many people are multiple marginalization that's happening. Yeah. I also, our coworker Candace couldn't come tonight, and she did give me a little reflection to read. If you wanted me to read it, I can read it to the group.
yeah.
Okay. So Candace says, reading Being Human felt very familiar to me as a person with a disability. Judith Heumann's experiences, especially around employment, reflected barriers I have also faced, not because of lack of ability, but because of low expectations. Like her, I've encountered systems that assumed I couldn't work competitively or independently before giving me real opportunities. What stood out most was her fight for meaningful employment. Her story shows that exclusion from work is often rooted in fear and stereotypes and not capability. I've seen this in my own life through token roles, limited responsibility, and assumptions about what I could handle. The book helped me name those experiences as systemic issues and not personal shortcomings. The book reinforced how powerful high expectations can be. The reason I'm working in leadership and advocacy and research today is because certain people expected me to succeed and provided structure and support, not lowered standards. The book reminded me that employment is about dignity, independence, and being seen as fully capable, and that raising expectations is one of the most powerful tools we have for inclusion. So
snaps, all the reactions for Candace.
Snaps for Candace.
Yeah.
So shout out to Candace.
Glad she sent that in for us.
Yeah.
Because we are a bit over time, that seems like a good reflection to close on.
All right. Yay. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Accessible. Accessible is hosted and produced by George Gatto, Amelia Reigard, and Catherine Toller from the University of Missouri, Kansas City Institute for Human Development, which is the home of the Missouri USED. Accessible is a joint project between the Missouri USED and the Missouri LEND program, which is funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services through grant number T73MC00022. Episodes of Accessible are released every 2 weeks and can be found wherever you subscribe to your podcasts.
Join us next time to hear more insights and ideas from leaders in the disability world.